Good morning, everyone. Yesterday we saw that Moses has the technical qualities needed to be the one to lead the people out of Egypt because of his Egyptian training in Pharaoh's court. But he still relied on his own strength in his own way. So God used his failure to accomplish things his way to take Moses to a place where God could prepare his character to be the man that God needed Moses to be. God often uses the wilderness, literal or metaphorical wilderness, to teach his servants to walk in faith in him, in humility before him, and to walk in dependence on him. God was preparing Moses. Now we're going to finish chapter 2 today, and we're going to see that God is preparing the people as well. Now, it might sound crazy to say this, but the people were not ready to be rescued by Moses when Moses tried to do it under his own power. Let's read the last couple of verses of chapter 2, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then after this is over, go reread the whole chapter on your own and think about what we've learned. During those days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So in the first two chapters of this story, we have already seen that God was working behind the scenes. But up until this point, God's hardly mentioned at all. And when he is mentioned before this, it's not really having anything to do with the suffering of the people. Finally, here we get the first direct statement about God in relationship to their suffering. We finally hear from God. He begins to take center stage of the story right here. Now we might ask though, why was God waiting? Why didn't God redeem the people from slavery right after that first Pharaoh who began the slavery in the first place? Well, I hate to disappoint you kids, but you need to learn early on in life that the why questions of God doing things hardly ever get answered. Knowing why God does something is not something that God reveals to us very often, at least not in the specific details of why. Yet in this text, we can see a few possibilities that help us to think about what God may be doing in their lives and what God may be doing in ours when we suffer and ask why. First, all of this suffering, and even the length of it, shows the Jews that nothing can stop God's plan. Several pharaohs had done everything they could to stop the growth of the Jews, and all that they had done simply made the Jews even more fruitful, which, from a human perspective, should be impossible. And kids, from a big picture perspective, the suffering of God's people shows us and the world that nothing can stop God's plans. We can see it in the book of Acts. There, when Stephen is killed, the disciples are scattered. And what's the result? Luke tells us, those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Later on, when James is killed, Luke tells us again that the result was, quote, the word of God grew and multiplied. Look at the history of the church. Whenever it is persecuted, it grows faster than anywhere else in the world or in history. And of course, Jesus himself shows us this. His suffering did not stop God's plan. It was the very means that God used to accomplish his plan. Now, the second thing, suffering shows the Hebrews, and it shows us, the importance of prayer. And we need to learn it. You know, I'm embarrassed to say that very often, most often, my first response to hard things is not to pray. My first response is to figure out what to do. Well, it wasn't the first response of the Jews to pray either. God had to take them to a point where prayer was all they had left, so they would learn to depend on that and cry out to him. Sometimes God has to do that with us. I tell you, one of the results of this time, at least I know in my life, is that I am praying a lot more than I ever have before. And I know a lot of Christians are doing that too. Suffering does that. Third and finally, suffering made the Jews long for their freedom. They had been suffering in slavery for generations, but they still did not cry out to God until just now. Only here do we see that they are completely fed up with their slavery and their suffering and long for the freedom that God can bring them. You see, they needed to know beyond any doubt that Egypt was not their home. You see, when things were good in Egypt, they would not have wanted to leave Egypt. They needed to suffer and long for that freedom to want to leave. And you know, we need that too. One of the reasons we suffer, at least in general, is because God needs to show us that this world is not our home. We're pretty comfortable here, even during quarantine times, and we can easily forget that we need to be longing for and praying for the new creation that Jesus has secured and won for us. There was a guy named Dan McCartney who wrote a book called Why Does It Have to Hurt? And in it he says this: "It is hard enough for us to leave aside the treasures of this evil world, even though we suffer in it. How much harder is it for us to desire the new heavens and new earth when our lives are comfortable?" Kids, I don't know the specific reasons why you suffer and other people suffer, but I do know that they can teach us that nothing can stop God's plan, the importance and our need of prayer, and to long for heaven. And remember, this world is not our home. Let this quarantine time teach you that, as well as any other suffering that comes in your life, like it taught the Jews. You guys think about that. I'll see you again tomorrow.